Fussy eating, weight loss, playing in their water, messing about with their tongue and lips, misbehaving under saddle, anxiety, colic, discomfort after eating, poor performance, crib biting and a rough hair coat. They're all some of the many indications that your horse may have gastric ulceration. And to add complexity to this problem, for some horses, there are no indications at all. As horse owners, gastric ulcers are an ever-present worry. They're painful for our horses and time-consuming and expensive to treat. In many cases, they're also reasonably easy to prevent. Ulceration is largely a disease of domestication and happens because of the way we manage our horses. So, if you understand the disease, what causes it and how to prevent it, reducing your off-the-track's risk of ulceration becomes relatively simple. Let me show you how, but first, let's take a quick look at the physiology of your horse's stomach. Our horses' stomachs are made up of two regions, the upper squamous region and the lower glandular region. When you look at these two regions by gastroscope, you will see the upper region is pale in colour and skin-like, while the lower glandular region is thicker and darker in colour. The lower section of a horse's stomach secretes gastric acid as part of the normal digestive process 24/7. There is no on-off switch for the acid flowing into the stomach. This region of the stomach also secretes thick mucus to protect itself from being burnt by the acid. The top part of the stomach has no mucus protection from the acid. Instead, it relies on the stomach always being full of fibre and the horse to be almost constantly chewing, so it is diluting the stomach acid with alkaline saliva. Combined, the fibre and saliva protect the delicate lining of the top of the stomach from acid burn. This design in the stomach was created over 55 million years of evolution. And we can only assume it was near perfectly adapted to a horse's natural environment. But in what can be considered the blink of an evolutionary eye, during the last 5,000 years, or just 0.01% of the time they've roamed this earth, we have drastically changed the way horses eat by domesticating them, taking them from almost 100% forage and fibre-based diets that were consumed via grazing and browsing over much of a 24-hour period, to eating lower forage diets, often with grains added and fed in meals. And this has spelled physiological disaster for our horses, with one of the most common problems caused by our human-designed feeding systems being equine gastric ulcer syndrome, or EGUS. Equine gastric ulcer syndrome, or EGUS, is an umbrella term used to describe ulcerative conditions of the horse's stomach. EGUS is then divided into two main conditions: equine squamous gastric disease, or ESGD, which is the ulceration that occurs in the top part of the stomach, and equine glandular gastric disease, or EGGD, which is the ulceration that occurs in the lower section of your horse's stomach. The reason I am explaining this with all of these weird words and annoying acronyms is it matters a whole lot to understand that there is a difference between ulcers that occur in the top of your horse's stomach and ulcers that occur in the bottom. They are caused by different factors, their symptoms can be different, and the type as well as the length of treatment also usually varies. This Queensland Off the Track video is going to focus only on the squamous ulcers, the ones found in the top of the stomach. But please remember, if your horse is diagnosed with gastric ulcers, it is critically important to understand where those ulcers are in your horse's stomach, so that, together with your vet, you can treat them properly and put the right measures in place to try and prevent them in the future. In their most basic form, squamous ulcers are caused by the acid from the bottom of the stomach splashing or squeezing up and literally burning holes through the skin-like lining of the top section of the stomach. With repeated exposure to the acid, the ulceration can go from a thickening of the lining to deep bleeding ulcers. What causes the acid to travel upwards and burn through their own stomach lining? Well, remember how I mentioned that horses evolved over 55 million years? Their stomach was designed for an animal that was freely roaming around and eating almost constantly. In their natural environment, their stomach was almost always full of fibre, so that the acid rarely physically had the opportunity to splash or squeeze upwards. And if it ever did, it was diluted with saliva, so it was less likely to cause acid burn. But now we need the stomach to cope with extended periods of time without food, riding, training, travelling, competing, stabling, or being kept without free access to forage, living without their herd, and eating lower forage, higher grain diets. It's a lot to throw at a stomach that was not designed or adapted to cope with any of these conditions. And unfortunately, squamous gastric ulcers are often the outcome. But it's not all bad news. With just a little bit of understanding of your off-the-track stomach physiology, you can put feeding management practices into place that will give you an excellent chance of preventing squamous gastric ulcers. Here are my best 3 tips for preventing these ulcers in your off-the-track. If I could be given just 2 minutes with every horse owner in the world, this is what I'd teach them. Feed, loosen hay before you ride. Let me show you why, using my trusty milk bottles as models for your horse's stomach. Remember I said a horse's stomach secretes acid 24/7? This means even when your horse stops eating and even if their stomach empties, the stomach will still be secreting acid. Which means if you go to ride your horse and your horse has an empty or near empty stomach, there will be a pool of acid sitting at the bottom and no fibre to stop it splashing or squeezing to the top. So as your horse starts to move, the acid will splash or get squeezed upward, and you will unconsciously bathe that fragile top part of your horse's stomach in acid during a ride, which will have 2 outcomes. 1, it will be painful for your off-the-track to be ridden, and you will likely see that in their behaviour. And 2, it will cause ulceration. Research from the University of Florida showed that when horses were worked on an empty stomach, the pH in the top part of the stomach could drop below a pH of 1. Normally, the pH in this upper section of the stomach should remain above a pH of 4, which is 1,000 times less acidic than a pH of 1. If you Google fluids with a pH of 1, you will likely read warnings about these substances being highly corrosive and needing to be handled with extreme care. And yet, if you ride your horse with an empty stomach, this is potentially what's being splashed about in there. The antidote? Feed, loosen hay before you ride. Loosen helps in 3 wonderful ways. First, it provides the all-important fibre barrier that physically stops the acid splashing to the top of the stomach. It causes the horse to chew and salivate, which floods the stomach with acid buffering saliva. It dilutes the acid and raises the pH, so even if it should splash, it won't be nearly as damaging. Loosen itself is a natural acid buffer, so it also helps to raise the pH of the fluid in the stomach, making it much less capable of burning holes through the lining of the top of the stomach. How much do you need to feed? The simple answer is enough to fill the stomach with fibre and saliva. But how much is that? To help, we have put this simple guide for how much lucerne to feed before you ride into the ebook for you. The more we can mimic the diet a horse has evolved to eat, the less risk of gastric ulcers. The most important aspect to mimic is to keep them chewing on forage. The longer we can keep a horse eating pasture or hay throughout a 24-hour period, the lower their risk of squamous ulcers will be. One, because the fluid in their stomach will be a much less acidic mix of saliva and hydrochloric acid that is not nearly as capable of burning holes in the top of the stomach. And two, the near constant intake of forage means the stomach will be kept full for most of a 24-hour period. Exactly the way nature intended. To keep your horse chewing, give your horse 24/7 access to pasture and/or hay. If your horse only has access to lush green pasture, you should also provide access to hay, as the low fibre, high moisture green pasture won't provide enough protection from ulceration. If you don't have pasture and are unable to provide 24/7 access to hay, you may need to slow down your off-the-tracks hay intake to make it last longer, so they're chewing for as much of a 24-hour period as possible. To do that, use hay bags, hay nets and hay balls. As a hard rule, don't ever let your off-the-track go for more than 6 hours without forage. And ideally, always aim to keep periods of time they are not chewing to less than 4 hours. And be mindful that it's not enough to just have forage available. You have to make sure your off-the-track is actually eating the forage. Having your off-the-track graze with friends will help to maximise the amount of time spent actually grazing and minimise the amount of time doing counterproductive things like fence walking or just standing at the gate. And for hay, make sure the hay is palatable and your off-the-track wants to eat it. Hay that your off-the-track